In a previous tutorial, we demonstrated the entry of an RMA into Sage 100 ERP. In this tutorial, we continue the RMA process by receiving the customer return and generating the related transactions. For our demonstration, we'll use an existing RMA where we are waiting to receive the returned items from our customer. In this tutorial, we'll process the receipt of the items, process a customer credit memo, process a vendor return, and order a replacement item. So now let's jump right in and get started. Let's begin by going to the menu tree and select Return Merchandise Authorization, Main, RMA Receipts Entry. Here we'll use the lookup to select our example RMA. The receipt date defaults to the current system date, which we'll accept, but note that it can be changed. The remaining information here defaults from the RMA entry. The customer number, RMA date, and RMA status cannot be changed, whereas the remaining information on the header may be updated as needed. Note the message Inspect on Receipt in red at the top of the window. This action is enabled below. If you charge a restocking fee for items that may be placed back into inventory and resold, the Apply Restocking Charges box may be checked after inspection. This will reduce the credit to the customer by the restocking charge. We'll leave this unchecked. To receive the items, we'll click on the Lines tab and we're prompted to receive complete RMA. Selecting Yes will mark all items on the RMA as received. Alternatively, you can select No, then enter the received quantity manually. This may be necessary if the items are being returned in separate shipments. We'll receive the complete RMA. Note that the lines here have different invoice numbers because in this case, one RMA was generated for items that were invoiced separately. Accordingly, for this customer, 2 credit memos will be generated so that each credit will be applied to the appropriate invoice. It's also important to note that the course of action selected for a return will generate different types of transactions. All actions are selected at the time of RMA entry, but may be changed during the receipt entry if the condition of the item was not as originally expected. Let's take a look at the first line item. Starting with customer action, it's set to credit. This will create a sales credit memo for the received quantity of 1. Other customer action options are None, Replacement, and Repair. Moving to item action, it's set to scrap. This option will generate a transaction that will be received into the scrap warehouse that you established in the RMA setup options. Other item actions are None, Stock, and Repair. Stock will receive the item into the selected warehouse, and Repair will be received into the warehouse that you established in RMA setup options to await further action. And finally, vendor action is set to credit. This will create a return of goods entry in purchase orders. Other options here are None and Replacement. Replacement will create a PO return of goods entry along with a purchase order for the replacement. Reviewing the second line, the customer and item actions are the same as line 1, but the vendor action is set to Replacement. Now we'll click Accept to save the receipt. Since we have no more receipts to enter, we'll close the window. Now let's go back to the menu tree and under Return Merchandise Authorization, Main, we'll select Generate Transactions. Let's review the fields and options here. The generation date defaults to our current system date and can be changed if needed. The next automatic sales order and invoice numbers default from the sales order module Next Number Available. Sales order/credit memo option to consolidate restocking charges may be selected to combine the restocking charge for each item being returned into one miscellaneous charge. This checkbox is available if Calculate Restocking Charges is selected in the RMA options. Print line information on listing will print restocking charge, warranty code, invoice number, price warranty expiration, cross-ship, drop-ship, and credit freight information on the Generate Transactions listing. The next automatic purchase order and purchase return numbers default from the purchase order module Next Number Available. Moving to the purchase order/return order options. When processing multiple RMAs, selecting Consolidate by Vendor will place all items returned on all RMAs to a specific vendor on one return of goods and/or purchase order. Clearing the checkbox will generate a separate return of goods and purchase order for each RMA processed. We'll leave this unchecked. Summarize multiple items will generate one detail line for the total return quantity of an item to a vendor. Deselecting the checkbox will include each item in a separate detail line for each purchase or return order. We'll leave this unselected. Add RMA number as a comment line will print the RMA number as a comment on the purchase or return order. If Consolidate by Vendor Number is selected above, multiple comment lines are created to list all of the RMA numbers. We'll leave this selected. In the selection area, we can choose to generate transactions for all RMAs, a range, or a specific RMA. We'll leave it set to all and then hit Proceed. Next, we'll click the printer icon to open the RMA Generate Transactions listing window. We'll print full comments on the listing, and for demo purposes, we'll preview it on our screen. This report recaps the receipts entered, and you should review the listing for accuracy. Moving on, we'll close the window and click Yes to generate documents from received RMAs. Now let's take a look at the generated documents. We'll begin by reviewing the customer actions. To do this, we'll return to the menu tree and open Sales Order, Main, Invoice Data Entry. Recall that both line items on the RMA Receipts entry had a customer action of credit, and each item originated from different invoices. Clicking the lookup, we can see the two credit memos that were created by the RMA Generate Transactions option. Let's first review number 100058. Notice the Apply to Invoice number and RMA number are listed on the header. Clicking over to the Lines tab, note that the detail line here was created based on the receiving information for that line and invoice. And moving to the Totals tab, you can see the total of the credit that will be applied to the customer's account when the invoice is posted. Let's click Accept. Now let's quickly review the second credit memo for the item returned on a separate invoice. Again, we can see the Apply to Invoice number and RMA number on the header. And moving to the Lines tab, there's the line item for the invoice it was returned against. Continuing to the Totals tab, here we can see the total credit that will be applied to the customer's account. Let's click Accept and close the window. Note that we're not going to cover printing and updating of the credit memos. Now let's review the transactions generated based on the vendor action. You may recall that the vendor action on line 1 of the customer return was set to credit, and on the second line was set to replacement. Both lines automatically generated a return of goods to the vendor. So let's take a look at them by going to our menu tree and select Purchase Order, Material Requisition and Returns, Return of Goods Entry. Using the lookup, we'll select return number 1007. Note that you can add the vendor authorization number and invoice/credit number if they're provided by your vendor. We'll leave the remaining default entries as is, and now we'll move on to the Lines tab. The primary vendor for both items is set to the same vendor in Item Maintenance. Therefore, both items from the customer return are listed together here on the same return of goods. Notice the comment line that references the RMA associated with the return. Again, this option was selected during the Generate Transactions process. Clicking over to the Totals tab, we can see the total credit expected from the vendor. Let's click Accept and close the window. You would then complete the return of goods process. Again, we're not going to cover the printing and updating of the purchase order return of goods. Continuing on, recall that the second item on the customer return was set to a vendor action of replacement. This will generate a purchase order for the item so that it may be receipted in from the vendor. Let's take a look at this PO by going back to the menu tree and under Purchase Order, select Main, then Purchase Order Entry. From the lookup, we'll select the last PO. Again, this order was automatically created when we generated the RMA transactions. As with the return of goods entry, we're not going to cover these fields in detail, so we'll leave the default information and continue to the Lines tab. Here we can see the item number that we're requesting a replacement for, along with a comment line containing the RMA number. And that completes our tutorial. So to recap, data entry may be streamlined during the customer return process by selecting appropriate customer, item, and vendor actions. Customer credits, vendor returns, and purchase orders can be generated during the RMA receipt entry along with the associated transactions. Give us a call if you need assistance with this or any other feature in your Sage 100 ERP system. Well, that's it for this tutorial. Bye for now.